Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Before we begin, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We need you. We're approaching 700 subscribers, which is great. Our target right now is 1,000. It'd be wonderful if we could get that on board here in the next couple of weeks. But obviously, if you're watching it somewhere else, please like and share. We're at whatever platform you're watching us on. Tonight's episode, we're dealing with the subject of discretion. And the reason I brought up discretion is because it's one of those concepts I just kind of assume that people understand and know about. So when I say discretion and I talk about how it affects qualified immunity or absolute immunity, I just kind of automatically assume that people know what that means. Well, I had a conversation this week with someone about what he felt was a due process right. The essential breakdown was his belief that if he reports a crime, he has a due process right to have it prosecuted. I mean, legitimate crime, legitimate issue. He feels he's within his constitutional rights to demand that the issue be prosecuted. Sadly, that's not how due process works. Due process entitles you to right of access to court and a host of other benefits, but it doesn't command a prosecutor or a government official to act on your behalf, even if it's a legitimate issue. That's where discretion comes in. I would explain to him is that prosecutors, law enforcement, pretty much all government officials have discretion to act or not to act. That's a principal element of their function. It's the biggest principle that underlies qualified and absolute immunity. What it's based on. Discretion. They have discretion to do things and not face consequences for doing them. Likewise, they have discretion not to do things and not face consequences for not doing them, so long within the parameters and purview of their duties. Of course, in many cases, it's not right nor fair, but it is how our system works. And because of this, I decided maybe I need to take an episode and just kind of talk about what discretion is, about what it all means. And more importantly, how it empowers the Great Montana Conspiracy and other corrupt organizations and groups across the country. Because more and more, the courts have basically decided that government officials are entitled to this discretion and entitled to immunity because of this discretion, regardless of how blatant and flagrant the discretionary choices are. Cornell Law School defines discretion as the power of officials to act according to the dictates of their own judgment and conscience. This is important because too often people's decisions on whether to act or not to act in official capacity, or what's often known as state actors, is not based upon personal choice of the situation or even their own conscience. It's based upon what they can get or what the advantage they can gain by choosing to act or not to act. Then it doesn't come down to a personal conscience, it comes down to corruption. And unfortunately, allowing discretion in this capacity and allowing the broad nature of immunity that has become inherent because of it has led to far too much corruption. Obviously, it's a huge issue when it comes to things like the Great Montana Conspiracy or any other issue of corruption when you're dealing with government. Basically, it is the power of an official to decide to act or not to act. Very simple. Do I do this? Do I not do this? Or more specifically, it's the power to choose whether to act or not to act. A police officer can choose to believe or not believe a witness. If someone says, "There's a squirrel on my roof," the officer can look at the guy and say, "This guy's clearly out of his... there's a monkey up there with him, and there's a chimpanzee." The officer can look at the guy and say, "You are clearly drunk. You're clearly intoxicated, high, something," and make that discretionary call and say, "I don't have to go on the roof and look for a squirrel, a monkey, and a chimpanzee, because this guy is clearly not within his right mind. He's obviously hallucinating. He's obviously under the influence of some foreign substance, and he can make the discretionary choice not to act. If he didn't have that discretionary power, he'd be forced to go up there and look with his flashlight, get on the top of the roof, maybe in the middle of winter, maybe there's ice up there, maybe there's other risks of harm, but he has to take the time, get a ladder, climb up there, and thoroughly search the roof for where these three imaginary animals are." Think about it. Can you imagine the guy on the ground is probably changing his story? Oh, you didn't look, they jumped down the alley, quick, go down the alley. Oh, wait a minute, they're back over here. And the officer, if he doesn't have the right to discretion to choose not to do those things and not pursue these various wild imaginations and hallucinations, would be required to jump through every single hoop this person who's hallucinating is providing him. So yeah, it does provide a justifiable basis. The officers do have to exercise some degree of discretion. I mean, a prosecutor can decide whether to prosecute or not to prosecute. I mean, if you have an ex-girlfriend that breaks up with a guy and she's mad at him because he cheated on her, and it's pretty obvious that's what she's mad about, and she accuses him of taking her valuable, Rembrandt painting and burning it in the backyard, and this girl lives in a trailer, obviously the prosecutor is going to say, well, wait a minute. Where did you get a Rembrandt, and why should we believe there was ever one conveniently that just got burned up in the backyard? Certain prosecutions are obviously maliciously targeted. Sometimes prosecutors have to make a decision about whether to pursue every single small little arrest or whether to actually go after the ones that are actually significant enough to cause harm to the community at large. A judge can decide on a host of things. A judge can decide whether or not a case belongs in the court. If I want to sue somebody because she's looking at me funny across the street and I want $10 million in damages because she looks at me funny across the street with a lazy eye, then the judge should have the ability to use his discretion and say, this suit makes no sense. There's no foundation, there's no merit here, throw it out. And that's just, and that's right, because certain issues are so flagrantly lopsided that it's clear that something else is going on besides what's being reported to the official at hand. But then you don't have a clear-cut line on where discretion should start and where it should end. Discretion plays a huge factor in both qualified and absolute immunity. It gives the officials the ability to act without fear of consequence. And in a normal function in a perfect society, that'd be great. I mean, honestly, if a councilman has to vote on an issue, he shouldn't have to say, I can't vote because I don't know if I'll be sued. I'll be sued by these people if I vote for it. I'll be sued by these people if I vote against it. He should have the discretion to make his choice without fear of consequence. Just like a law enforcement official, if he's chasing a car down the road and pulls him over, he should have the discretion of whether to ticket the guy or whether he's going to be sued. I mean, there's certain amounts that are obviously plain. This can be a good thing since officials could be hamstrung over fear of consequences. I mean, using the councilman example, imagine if the councilman cannot cast a vote because he's afraid of being sued. He can't make a decision one way or the other because either act will lend him to being sued by somebody. Or a police officer hears a woman cry from inside a house, thinks she's in mortal danger, but he's fearful of his own arrest for breaking and entering because he's trespassing onto property. He has to have discretionary power to say, okay, I have a reasonable belief that harm is being caused to this woman, and I have a right to go on that property to investigate these cries that I have heard. But what happens if you get sued with the property owner? You didn't have a right to be on the property. You didn't have a right to break and enter. You had no way of knowing it was a real person or a recorded video or a television show. All these issues come up, which is why the officer has to have the discretion to act in his own judgment and his own conscience and try to look into it. If he can get sued, if he can lose his life, his livelihood, he can lose his job because he makes this discretionary choice, that's not fair either. It is an important function of officials and their jobs and their daily duties, just as it would be in any business. But just as qualified immunity is a good principle, absolute immunity is a good principle, well, maybe not absolute. I've never been a fan of absolute immunity. Never been a fan of it. But immunity is a general rule for certain actions, so long as a person is acting within the confines and the functions of their office and their duties, is a good thing. I'm not saying throw out discretion and throw out immunity, because it does exist for a good reason. The problem is, there's a lack of consequences leads to more abuse than good. It just does. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. The principle is there. If you don't have consequences for your actions, and you don't have to worry about consequences regardless of which action you take, without some kind of oversight to say, wait a minute, that's wrong, then we lose the principle and the function for that this is supposed to work for. Discretion is designed to give someone the ability to make decisions that are for the good of the office that they hold, not for their own self-benefit, and certainly not to protect their friends or shelter others from consequence that should be facing consequences. There's a host of advantages to the principle. I mean, police, they don't have to respond to every single prank call. If you've got a college group of kids that decided to prank the police department, they have the ability to say, this is obviously a prank, and they can discard it. They can say they can choose not to chase their cars and drive around looking for pink elephants on parade. They can do that. They can choose not to arrest someone, even if they're breaking the law in the interest of justice. For instance, if a girl hits her boyfriend in self-defense, technically by law, she struck another person and she should be arrested for assault. But what if it's a self-defense action? The officer can make a decision at that time. Well, obviously, she was on the ground, beaten and bloody, and she punched him in self-defense. I don't have to arrest her. Discretion. The kid walks out with a candy bar in his pocket. Mom doesn't know. Should the kid go to jail because he walked out? Should mom go to jail for aiding and abetting? No, of course not. The kid picked up a candy bar, didn't tell mom, put it in his pocket, walked out. Kid probably forgot he picked up the candy bar. Didn't even think about the consequences. Walked out. Oh, wait a minute, I'm eating a candy bar in the back seat. If there's no malice of intent, if it's a little child, like maybe a 2 or 3 year old who's got impulse control issues, and the mom clues that no, should there be an arrest? Technically, the law was broken. Technically, the kid stole. Technically, the mom aided and abetted by taking the child away from the scene. But the discretionary issue is the police officer, in the interest of justice, can recognize this was an obvious, simple mistake and not arrest or charge them. Prosecutors can make a decision if they think a case is made up. They can decide whether or not, hey, she stole the Rembrandt, or he stole the Rembrandt and burned it in my backyard. Obviously made up. Prosecutors can make that decision. Judges can cut short proceedings if they have no actual merit. These are all benefits of the discretionary process. The problem is that it causes more problems than it fixes when corruption is allowed to exist. Cronyism, as an example. Appointing friends and people loyal to positions of power, regardless of whether they're qualified or not. If you have a police officer who says, I've got a position opening up in my office, but I'm going to give it to my girlfriend, rather than to the secretary who has 20 years of experience working in this kind of office, it's cronyism. When you have a judge who says, I'm going to appoint my mistress to be my clerk so she can give me hand jobs in the back office, she's not qualified as a clerk, but she's qualified for what he wants to be qualified for. Cronyism. We saw a whole bunch of this, and I'm not taking a political stance. We saw a whole bunch of this with President Trump, where he would appoint people to positions of authority, ambassadorships, positions in government. They had no clear qualifications for their positions, but they were friends of his. They were people who were loyal to him, and therefore he appointed them. Cronyism. I mean, prosecutors don't prosecute elite or fellow government officials. They protect and shelter them. Same with police arrests. If a police officer pulls over another police officer, that police officer, chances are, is not going to go to jail, regardless of the offense. I personally have witnessed situations to where the prior Judge Stuart Stadler, would get pulled over for drunk driving. He'd be taken to the sheriff's department and held there until somebody could come pick him up. I witnessed this because I was in the Flathead County Jail for 20 months. In that 20 months, I know of 3 separate instances in which Stadler was brought in, one of which I witnessed personally. Two different times, people came in and said, hey, Stadler's out there again waiting for a ride. And we'd all laugh about it. We all knew that he would never get charged. I remember walking back from the law library. They call the law library. Flathead County Detention Center is literally giving you a couple of law books, putting you in a visitor's cubicle, which is basically 2 feet by 2 feet, and sit there for 45 minutes. But that was the law library in Flathead County Jail. So I had to go walk back from there, and I'm walking back, and there's Stuart Stadler sitting there on the bench, And I look over at him and he waves at me. Just a big old grin on his face. Just waves at me. This is an example of elitism. This is an example of discretion that is abused. The problem is that this can lead to both under-enforcement of the law and it can lead to over-enforcement of the law. In the case of lower, the police are lazy and they don't arrest anyone. They just say, you know what, we don't have to do this. This problem is that it emboldens criminals. Criminals say, oh, I'm not going to charge me for that. I just dealt with somebody who had, sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen, I just bumped my laptop as I'm sitting here doing this. My apologies for the background noise. But I just dealt with a situation and circumstance where someone, I repeatedly going over with this person over and over and over again, telling her, you know, you've got to be careful because I know she's fallen back into drug use. And I'm saying you've got to be careful. These people you're hanging around, this person has a warrant. This person has these circumstances and situations. And if the police come looking for them and they arrest them when you're there, you can face consequences. The warrant that her boyfriend was on was just a violation of police conditions. It was a felony violation of police conditions. But there was no underlying arrest. We couldn't figure out what the underlying arrest was for. I remember having a discussion with her about, well, it's, you know, knowing that, you know, you both are drug users, it's probably a drug-related offense. Did he tell you what it was about? She said, no, he didn't tell me what it was about, but it can't be over drugs because they don't arrest people for just using drugs. They don't arrest people for just using drugs. Well, of course they arrest people for using drugs all the time. Her perception was they're basically too small a fish to worry about being prosecuted because they're worried about trying to find the buyers or trying to find the distributors or I previously released that 87% of all prosecutions in the United States are for possession alone. But her belief is that locally, and I have seen it locally, where officers are well aware that somebody is using, possessing, the whole bit, and ignore it. Because there is so much of it, they don't want to deal with arresting every single person they come across who is under the influence or who is using or possessing or even selling. I've seen officers protect drug houses in Kalispell. I have seen them drive around drug houses. I have seen them go and say, okay, we want to keep this drug, and I actually ask officers, why do you allow this? Why do you let, you know where the drug house is, you see these people buying and selling out in the front yard, you see them smoking hash pipes in the front yard, and you don't stop and ask questions? And one officer's response was, well, we don't do it because if we break up the drug house, then we won't know where people are when we want to come looking for them or warrants. That was their reasoning. So yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a perception amongst criminals that they can basically do whatever they want so long as they keep it below a certain threshold in Kalispell. So when she's sitting here telling me that they don't arrest you for just using or just having a little bit of drugs, she's not entirely wrong. But the problem is that it emboldens the criminals, it emboldens the drug users, it emboldens the drug use in Kalispell. Because it means that the officers are lazy, they don't want to get involved, or perhaps they're getting kickbacks or whatever. Their reasoning, their rationality, they simply don't arrest the low-level offenders, and the low-level offenders know this, and they can get away with it, and so they just basically don't care. It leads to an increased amount of open drug use in the community that isn't hindered in any manner, shape, or form because they know that they're protected. By the way, it did turn out that this person's arrest was on a felony criminal possession of dangerous drugs originally. Apparently at one point he was released. He violated whatever release conditions they set for him, whether it be he didn't put on a drug patch, or he didn't put on an ankle monitor, or perhaps he didn't report in like he was supposed to. Don't know. I do know that obviously her perception that it wouldn't have been a drug charge is not necessarily the truth. But I can see where her perception is that they don't arrest you for just the little stuff. And I don't know whether maybe he was involved in a much bigger thing. Don't know. All I do know is that that perception, that underperformance, because police officers don't aggressively pursue that particular issue, it emboldens the criminals to keep doing what they're doing. Now, I do need to make a side note here to remind you that I do not think that the criminal justice system should be pursuing drug users. I think that drug users are a victim of a medical condition. They should receive court-mandated drug treatment, drug counseling, they should be doing a lot more in the realm of treating it as a disease than treating it as a crime. But nevertheless, at the current standard, it is a crime, and it is a crime that is frequently ignored. That's my point, what I'm making here. In the case where police are overzealous, it leads to brutal and unnecessary arrests. It leads to things like racism. It leads to racial disproportionate actions. We just saw this with the Floyd issue and the protests that arose from that in recent years. It can lead, like I said, it can lead to uprisings, as we saw. It can lead to protests. Stronger organized crime organizations tend to prosper in harsher times because there's safety in numbers. People come together in organized criminal activities. They come together in organized structures. It's no longer the individual doing the impulsive crime. It is the groups coming together to shelter and protect each other. Those people who are protected tend to stay free. Those people who are not are the ones who end up in jail. Consequently, organized crime becomes more powerful in stronger, overzealous environments. Too many see discretion as an unlimited authority, though. And that's the problem here, is because when you have police officers or you have judges who believe that they have unlimited power, then they don't feel they have to restrain themselves in any manner, shape, or form. Their biases, their bigotries, their prejudices, they all come out because they don't have to face the consequences for their actions. They never have to get sued. They never have to face jail time. They never have to face consequences. They don't even lose their jobs because their jobs aren't a fireable offense. In most cases, unless they're impeached judges or other officials, there are other methods of removal. But when you have the good old boy network that protects them, it's not really going to happen anyway, and they know this. When you have this bulletproof concept, this idea that they're above the law, they don't have to face consequences for their actions or the harm they cause in their decisions, it leads officials to feel they can do anything without fear of consequence, including criminal misconduct, including less than meritorious acts. Remember, a legal official, whether it be government, whether it be anyone, even if it be an official inside a corporation, the primary duty of that official is act in the best interest of the charge and the faith that's given them to act in that principle. If you are a government official, you are charged with a duty and an expectation that you are going to work in the best interests of the community of which you serve. But when you don't feel you have to, corruption arises. As I said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is a definite belief of the self-empowered absolute power genre and the mindset that these people have. If you have this idea that you have no consequences, that there are no penalties for your actions, no penalties for whatever you do, you don't have a reason to act within the restraints. And unfortunately, this basic human nature that it leads to self-interest. It just does. If we worked as a model society and a model race that once you took that oath of office, you were bound by the oath of office and you could not possibly breach it, great, but that's not human nature. And I think anybody that listens to this knows that. The biggest problem that comes from this, I mean, not perhaps the biggest problem, but another element that's absolutely critical when you're talking about issues of discretion is that, and the problems with discretion, is that people of wealth and influence tend to get better treatment. They get the benefits of protection and shelter that the poorer elements of society simply don't get. Discretion gives officials wide latitude to pander to powerful and wealthy. It basically gives them the choice of who to help and who not to help. Whether giving benefits to friends or seeking advantage or simply chasing campaign contributions. The idea is that the wealthier people tend to get better treatment from officials. They get better attention, they get more response time. Statistics demonstrate that wealthier people tend to benefit from this discretion so much more. There's considerably fewer prosecutions and arrests. Judges decide in favor of wealthier clients more often, wealthier parties more often than poorer parties. Corporations, businesses, like 80% of the time you're going to get a decision that's in favor of a large corporation or a large business or someone who's wealthy over a single person. Officers tend to profile based on lack of wealth. It's a fact, they do. Presumption is that someone who is rich does not need to break the law. And that's obviously a bad presumption because, ironically enough, someone who is rich may very likely have committed crimes to be rich, or through the preferential treatment process that this exists. They don't get called on their crimes, and therefore they're allowed to proliferate whatever they're doing, which may be criminal, to get that wealth. Oftentimes, this is an element that leads to racial profiling, because you look at someone who's black or Hispanic or Oriental, and the presumption is that, well, because they're not white, and because they're maybe driving a poor vehicle, or perhaps they're doing something that a white person could do without suspicion, but a black person is going to get picked up on, that leads to racial profiling. You look at somebody who's racially different and make a decision about their wealth and their capacity to have wealth. And yes, discretion leads to profiling, racial and otherwise. In fact, discretion fuels racism and discrimination. When left to the personal opinions of officials, negative conduct, it dominates. It just takes over. It allows it to proliferate without any kind of restriction or consequence. Discretion lends towards officials being given the benefit of the doubt. Even when they're the criminals, officials are given a higher bar when accused of a crime. Oh, he's a councilman, he wouldn't do that. He's a police officer, he wouldn't do that. Once again, it lends towards the bulletproof mentality. Anyone associated with officials tend to receive the same special treatment. Officials tend to shelter people close to them. If you're a friend of a judge and you get pulled over, you call your judge friend and the judge says, oh, dismiss the charge. Same with your friend's a police officer. Hey, call Chief so-and-so and he'll drop this. He'll explain to you that you don't need to worry about me. This is often called a power model. Benefits received that would otherwise not be available, but for the connection to the person in power. Discretion is used for self-benefit, and it can put people at risk of harm. I mean, not just with false arrests or with vexatious prosecutions, which unfortunately, as you know my situation, obviously a big issue. But if a police officer disregards a real threat, he doesn't want to be involved, or just another junkie on Skid Row kind of mentality, or simply because the person's race or social status, people can literally die. I mean, literally die, because the official decided not to do what they were supposed to do. The discretionary choice of to act or not to act lended toward, I don't feel like doing it, or I don't want to do it, or I don't like that guy. That guy's a punk. Why would I want to protect him? Oh, just some stupid kid. Why would I want to protect him? Oh, a city councilman. I want to protect him. Let's go protect him and shelter him. You see what I'm talking about? Take this example from real life. Two people enter into a business arrangement, but they fall out of the partnership. The current business owner isn't much liked by the local authorities, but they have no real legal reason to expel him. They just don't like him. He don't like he deals in cars and vehicles and scrap, and they just don't like him for whatever reason. We won't go into the reasons of why they like or just don't like, but they just don't. They just don't feel they really want that kind of business where it's located, and they decide they don't like him. 3 years later, the evicted partner comes back and tells law enforcement he needs access to the property. He claims he needs to run VIN checks on the vehicles that are there and to collect his own property from the business site. Officers let him in. And the ex-partner claims that he owns all the vehicles and a good chunk of the valuable property on the premises, and the officer lets him take it. He considers it a standby. He's going to stand by and let the guy take it. The prosecutor later refuses to prosecute the case, even though it's obviously grand theft auto here. He's basically claiming that it's a civil issue now, rather than a criminal issue. Because the civil issue was, it's an issue between you and Louise, who owned what. No, it's a criminal issue. The police officer let the individual on the property, let the individual take valuables from the property, which were not his. He had no right to claim to. But he took them. The officer allowed it, and now the prosecutor comes back and says, don't have to prosecute because it's not a crime. It's a civil issue. It'd be a civil issue if Louise, said the name, if the person wants to go to the business owner and say, oh, this is my property, then go to court and prove it's your property. Go to court and sue the business owner. Go to court and say, hey, this is not right. It's unfair. Go to court and get a judgment. Then the police officer can let you on because you'll have a writ of possession in your hand. But the police officer does not get to make that decision except discretionary rules allow him to. He can say, oh, I believed him. I believed the ex-business partner. I believed him when he said those were his things, so I let him take them. He's protected by his discretionary choice if that's his general motivation. But what happens if he's actually complicit? What happens if the officer's motivation is because he just doesn't like the business owner, and this is an opportunity to get the business owner out of that location? We'll just go ahead and help him get robbed. And the prosecutor steps in, and the prosecutor is not just saying, oh, I'm not sure if it's a civil issue or not. The prosecutor just doesn't want the officer prosecuted, and so he's protecting the officer because he knows if he actually goes in and brings charges against the ex-partner, that he then also has to press charges against the officer who acted complicitly to aid and abet a crime, a massive felony. The prosecutor gets to make these choices. That's discretionary. But discretion only works so far before it becomes harmful. Now, only if he can prove complicity can the business owner go after the government officials involved. And that's a really hard barrier to raise. He's working on it. And I've told him that's what he needs to do. He needs to contact the witnesses, he needs to get statements, get notarized statements and track all the property so that he can put it in front of the prosecutor and have it be an indisputable case. At that point, if the prosecutor continues to protect the police department, then that's it. Nail in the coffin. But jumping to conclusions, making speculation, you can't do that without dotting the I's, crossing the T's. Hearing the situation and circumstance, my choice in what I believe tends to believe the government officials are acting duplicitously, dishonestly, and definitely not within the range of what their discretion should allow. But until the business owner can prove the complicity, it becomes an issue of they're protected by their qualified immunity because of the discretionary choices involved. The principle of discretion here is based on a good foundation. It has a rock-solid reason for existing. It serves a legitimate purpose to keep millions of actions from being frivolously chased. If I scratch my ear, I should have the right to scratch my ear without someone saying, that person might be spreading disease because he just scratched his ear, now he has something under his nail, now he's walking around and touching things. I have the discretion to scratch my ear. It's a common sense thing, right? So what happens if an official does it? An official who's perhaps in the health department. He scratches his ear, and now it's an official thing because he's scratched his ear. You'd be amazed at how frivolous lawsuits can be when people are just given broad latitude to do or say whatever they want. And it can often be politically motivated. I mean, imagine if you simply don't want your opponent to run for office, so you get a bunch of your people or behind you to file frivolous lawsuits just to make it look like this guy's a bad guy. And if without discretion, these charges have to get pursued, the judges have to hear the cases to full, the person who's your opponent now has to defend against all these frivolous claims in court, possibly eating up the campaign bankroll that he may have collected just to defend against it. Obviously, not a wide and good system. Discretion does serve its purpose, but only if it's policed from the outside, from an independent agency, an independent oversight that overlooks and looks at these decisions and says, okay, this is right, this is wrong. Discretion to a certain degree is important, but discretion without consequence tends to lead to more harm than good. Remember, discretion is supposed to be based upon the judgment and conscience of the individual involved. Yet too often it is used to shelter officials who simply do not do their jobs for whatever reason, or who have committed crimes in the capacity of their jobs, and others are simply stepping in to protect them. In my case, it's discretionary power gave corrupt officials the ability to prosecute me and put me in prison for a crime they know I didn't commit, just to protect themselves from consequence and their own legal malfeasance. An example above, that I just talked about, it gave officers who did not like the business owner to stand by and let him be robbed blind. And then the officers involved are protected by the prosecutor's office, who simply does not want to prosecute the underlying offenses. And then afterwards, it permitted the prosecutor to choose whether or not to pursue charges. So after the act was done, after the consequences were felt, the prosecutor got to use his discretionary power to decide it's a civil case, not a criminal case. Obviously a wrong decision to you and me, but when you're talking about somebody who doesn't fear consequences for his discretionary choices, it gives him a broad latitude to do what's not right. The Great Montana Conspiracy, this principle is used constantly to justify the misconduct of state actors. But that is because there is no genuine oversight in Montana. Even the police department and sheriff's offices don't have internal affairs departments. They don't have an independent agency overseeing them. If there's a crime or a misconduct report, they investigate against their fellow officers. Or if it's an issue that's large enough, they simply go to a friendly neighboring county and ask them to overlook for them, and it's basically, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, because they'll just return the favor the next time it comes around. The good old boy system protects its own. And all the federal officers that I've been able to locate in Montana are all elevated from within Montana. They all have a pre-existing loyalty to Montana. Consequently, when you have absolutely no oversight, you have no concerns about being held accountable for discretion that's outside the boundaries of what's good common sense. This problem doesn't exist only in Montana. It's a national problem. It's a national problem in that it exists, obviously, in Idaho, it exists in Washington, it exists in Colorado, it exists in New York. But it exists here rampantly. At least in most jurisdictions, there are some independent oversights. Some governments have actually taken the role of allowing to have private organizations act as their oversight committees, people outside of government who have no affiliation with government whatsoever, to oversee their issues of discretion and their issues of immunity, which I think is the proper route, by the way. But the problem is you can only overcome these flaws if there's higher oversight, and if it has no pre-existing loyalty to people who are being investigated or being overlooked. In the United States, that should be the federal government. That's why we have RICO laws. I've done 2 previous podcasts on the subject of RICO, Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act. It permits the federal government to come in and act as an oversight of misconduct, even in government officials. But the federal agencies that have the ability to do this within the state of Montana are all placed and run by Montana loyalists. Consequently, you don't have the oversight you need to have. You need to have an independent agency outside the state to come in and oversee it. Hasn't happened. Hopefully someday these podcasts will reach someone and that will be done. But in the meantime, this is the current system we live under, and it allows for this proliferation of corruption. And that is why we have the Great Montana Conspiracy. Once again, I really appreciate everybody listening. I hope this information was valuable and you can use it with some degree of assistance. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is something I kind of assumed was a general topic that everyone just understood. If it's something you don't need further explanation or understanding on, I apologize I wasted your time, but I don't think I did. I think maybe I also provided even people who are learned in this subject some ideas and different insights possibly may not have had. Of course, as also mentioned at the top of this video, if you're watching this on YouTube, please take the time to like and subscribe. Share the video regardless of what platform you're watching this on. And if you want to help support our cause, by all means the information is in the text attached to this video. If for some reason you're not able to see text attached to this video is forwarded to you in some context that doesn't include that, feel free to visit the original site, monspiracy.podbean.com, which is where I upload this podcast to, and it distributes to the various platforms that you can find it on. Thank you once again for listening, and as always, whenever possible, please be safe, and more importantly, please be free. Thank you.